Okay, well, if all of you will take out a piece of paper, and if you need some, we have some up here. Take out a piece of paper and have a writing utensil. Have a pen or pencil. Okay? Before we start talking about refutation specifically, and refutation begins as early as this speech, because in part, this speech refutes what the first affirmative construction speech has said, correct? So, and we'll talk to you in more detail about what it even means to refute. But before we do that, if I make an argument, if I say, I think that nuclear power is a good idea, okay? If I say nuclear power is a good idea, the first reason why I think nuclear power is a good idea is because it's inexpensive. The second reason why I think nuclear power is a good idea is because it is cleaner for the environment than coal, for example. Okay? Now, if you are going to refute my arguments, how do you know what I just said? What did I just say? I had two reasons why nuclear power is a good idea. What were they?
Nuclear power is expensive.
Okay, nuclear power is inexpensive.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's for environment.
Okay, all right. Now, did you write those down?
Yeah.
Okay, see, she wrote them down, which is very smart. Chinley's very smart. She wrote them down. It's very difficult for you to give a speech in front of a judge and other people and respond to arguments if you don't write them down. So, here is an exercise. Some of you are probably a little sleepy, okay? So, I want you to listen carefully to what I say and write it down. That's all you need to do, okay? Can everyone hear me okay? Is my volume, okay. All right. King of diamonds, 10 of diamonds, 7 of spades, 10 of hearts, queen of clubs, 7 of hearts, 9 of diamonds, 6 of clubs, ace of diamonds. Who got that? Nobody? Okay. You want to try it again? 7 of clubs, 10 of spades, ace of clubs, 4 of hearts, 2 of hearts, 10 of clubs, 5 of clubs. Is that a little easier? All right, let's see how you did. What was the first card? 7 of hearts? 7 of clubs? Clubs. 7 of clubs, right, okay. What's the second card? 10 of spades, very good. What's the next one? What did you get for the third one? You couldn't hear? Ah, okay, well then I'll come back to you. How about the third one? No, ace of clubs was the third. The next one was? 4 of hearts, very good. Okay, then the 2 of hearts. All right, and the 10 of clubs, and I forget where we started. But, so you get the idea, okay? Some of you wrote it in Japanese, some of you wrote it in English, and some of you used abbreviations, or you actually started writing out the card, okay? In order to take notes when someone's giving a speech, you have to abbreviate. You know what that means? To abbreviate, to shorten words, or to use symbols, okay? So for example, the ace of clubs could easily be abbreviated with an A and a C, ace of clubs, because there are 4 suits in a deck: spades, clubs, diamonds, and hearts. So they all start with a different letter. So it's easy then to be able to pick out if it's a club, because that starts with a C, a heart starts with an H, and so on. We also know that of the cards in a standard deck, each suit has 13 cards. And if you know what suit it is, so a club, for example, putting a 10 next to it allows you to recognize each individual card. Okay? Now, when we do academic debates, we use a similar process. as you can already notice, we abbreviate these speeches. It would take you forever to write first affirmative constructive speech. By the time you write that, your opponent has already made 4 arguments. And so you've missed those arguments because you're writing out first affirmative constructive speech, right? And so that's not very helpful, is it? So we will abbreviate 1AC, 1NC, etc. There are other arguments that we obviously will be using in debates, and each debate topic that you debate will have its own set of terms, its own set of arguments that you will want to find abbreviations or symbols for. For example, on this topic, we clearly have this. GMOs, right? You definitely do not want to write out genetically modified organisms. That will take too long, right? If someone says GMOs are not good, you do not need to say that. Don't write out NOT. You can come up with a symbol, like not. For example, you can use your own system. It may be helpful that your partner also uses the same system because you may want to exchange notes, but even that is not a requirement. What's a requirement is that you yourself know what your system is and that you try to practice it and use it as much as possible. Which is why, I think it was yesterday, Shanna said that, well, it had been yesterday because that was my first day. Shanna said that you will learn skills that will help you in your classes and skills that you can use later on in life. This is one of those skills, note-taking. Because if you develop your own symbols and your own abbreviations, you can take down notes much more quickly and efficiently and accurately. And so that will help you in your classes and so forth. Okay? All right. I need an evidence packet.
We have it electronically.
No, I don't want that. May I borrow this? Thank you. Okay. Now Jake is going to help me out. You do not need to look at the evidence packet. Okay? Do not look at this. I want you to listen, and I want you to watch what he does. Okay? I will begin with the first affirmative speech, the 1AC. The first observation is inherency. Japan imports 44 different types of GM crops and has strict testing policies. And then I will read a piece of evidence, but I'm not going to do that for this exercise. Then I would state the plan. Therefore, I offer the following plan: that the Japanese Ministry of the Environment, the MOE, the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, MHLW, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, MAFF, will ban all importation, sales, and production of genetically modified foods. So my next set of arguments is observation 2, which is solvency. Subpoint A, the MOE is responsible for type 1 cases for GMOs. Subpoint B, the Japanese MHLW and the MAFF are responsible for GMO legislation. And since we're just banning genetically modified organisms, that should be sufficient to solve. So then, my next set of arguments will be the advantage, why my plan is beneficial. I'm going to talk about marine ecosystems. The A subpoint is Japan's water sources are vulnerable. Ishikawa proves this. And the B subpoint is that GMOs are responsible for contaminating our water resources all over the world. And finally, our aquatic and water-based ecosystems are critical to all ecosystems. All right, now do you want to explain to them what you've done here?
Sure. So you never need to write out the word observation, or sometimes you'll hear the word contention. Those are, like Dr. Z was saying earlier, those are long words that if you just write down a short abbreviation, you'll be able to look back and realize. So observation 1 is just OB1, or observation 2, advantage. There are also a lot of key terms that you hear in debate. Now, for example, the stock issue that we've discussed of solvency, that's a term that you are going to hear all the time in a debate round. You never need to write out the whole word solvency. For me, a very helpful system is to just write the letter S and then put a circle around it. That way I know it is a special term, but it is much quicker to write the letter S and circle it than to write out solvency. Okay? Common terms, like for example, you're going to hear the word Japan a lot on this topic. So for me, just J. You know that we're talking about Japan. Import 44, genetically modified organisms. Or when we're talking about the name of ministries, those are especially helpful because often in evidence, they are abbreviated right there. For example, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare is already abbreviated in most evidence as MHLW. So if you see an abbreviation in evidence, you should use that abbreviation because it will help you understand what the evidence is talking about as well. Okay? So over here, you see a lot of these all together. So the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare can solve GMO laws. They can create legislation. Okay. Do you see how all of this works so far? So the disadvantage further on. So this first piece of evidence says that Japanese ecosystems are very vulnerable right now. We're talking about the water sources. You don't need to write all of that down. Japan's water is vulnerable.
And vulnerable is even a long word. I probably would have just put risk. Japan's water is at risk or something.
Right.
So you also have to think, sometimes, you don't have to, but sometimes it's helpful to think of synonyms or other words so that you can use them if they're shorter. And notice that the ASA point here was Japan's aquatic ecosystems are vulnerable. Ishikawa proves, okay, which is a specific historical case study that proves that Japanese aquatic ecosystems are at risk. He does not need to put all of that down here, right? That's mostly for the judge's benefit, because I'm making this argument that there's a specific historical example that proves that they are vulnerable. For Jake, if he is the negative, he doesn't need to necessarily talk about that specific historical example. He can just talk about maybe other examples, or he could just talk about how generally Japanese water ecosystems are improving, those kinds of arguments. So he does not need to necessarily make any specific arguments against Ishikawa. Okay.
Another tool that when I'm flowing I think is very helpful is using arrows as signs. So for example, this second point, the B subpoint in this advantage, talked about how GMOs require all of these different chemicals that contaminate water supplies, right? Again, that is a lot, and it's helpful for the judge to hear all of that context, but when you're taking notes, you don't need to have all of that down to understand. So GMOs decrease, so the arrow is going down, water quality. So all of that summed up in just this amount of space. Okay.
Now, if I were the negative, and I'm not going to do very much, I'm just going to do a couple of arguments here. But if I were the negative, and I had a couple of arguments against the case, I might say that, of course it's probably the very last one, pretty much. I might say, different color. I might say on the advantage only, I might say GMOs reduce the need for insecticides. My second argument would be pesticide data is flawed. The only conclusion is that GMOs lead to milder chemicals. And finally, my third argument is the collapse of marine ecosystems takes thousands of years and there is no impact. Now, it's hard to write legibly in chalk very fast, but you can kind of explain that.
Sure. So, often when I'm flowing, so the first two pieces of evidence that Dr. Zampetti read talked about how the chemicals used for GMOs aren't that harmful for water, or that GMOs don't need that many chemicals. When you are flowing, it is best to try and match up those particular arguments side by side when you're taking notes with the argument that they're directly responding to. So those arguments about pesticides and chemical use directly respond to this B subpoint, right? That GMOs decrease water quality. So I have this bracket here to show that these arguments respond to this. And the first piece of evidence says that genetically modified organisms reduce the need to use chemicals. So GM decrease chem. Straightforward. The second piece of evidence made two arguments. So I had two quick lines of when I flowed. The first was that pesticide science is bad, so the affirmative's conclusions, their arguments can't be trusted. So pest data, bad. And the second is that GMOs require milder chemicals. So milder chemicals. Do you see how that works? Now, the last piece of evidence that Dr. Z mentioned had a lot of words in that tagline, that ecosystem collapse takes thousands of years and it's not that bad when it happens. What that's really saying is that even if the affirmative is right, that water contamination is going to cause an ecosystem collapse, it's not that big of a deal. So, no impact. So for me, if we're talking about the word impact, I have an I and a circle around it. It's kind of like solvency. Impact is a word you'll hear a lot, so I have a special symbol for it.
I use an exclamation point or an exclamation mark. So, you have different ways of doing it, but choose what works for you.
Yeah. But for those types of terms like solvency or impact, it's very helpful to have a special symbol that you understand. Okay. So no impact to ecosystem collapse.
Yeah, so a couple things I just want to point out real fast. One is that another reason why this bracketing is important, or another reason why you wanted to write down your notes directly in response to the argument that your opponent made, is because if there's a speech where there is no pink chalk, like over here, right? There's no pink chalk. That means that the negative didn't answer this stuff, right? And what do we call an argument that an opponent doesn't answer?
Drop.
Exactly. So yes, so that means that they drop the argument. And if it's an important argument, then you could lose the debate. Now, only if it's a really important argument. So for example, this argument over here, that Japan imports 44 genetically modified organisms, if the negative doesn't respond to that, it's not that big of a deal, right? They could agree to that. They could say, yeah, you're right, Japan imports 44 GMOs, but we will win that importing those GMOs is not bad. Okay, so they'll argue the harms. So in that sense, you have to make, you have to understand and you have to make a decision about what the most important arguments are. So if they're dropped, point that out. If they're important, if they're not important, don't waste your time because you only have 6 minutes or 3 minutes depending on which speech it is, right? So if it's not an important argument, don't say, oh, they dropped it, because so what, right? So be careful. The other thing I wanted to point out is notice how he has space in between each argument. See, there's space here. That's so that he can write this material. He's thinking in advance. Knowing that there are going to be more arguments in the debate, he leaves spaces here so that he can write those arguments right next to the corresponding or parallel argument. Okay? Does that make sense? So, do you want to talk about refutation, or shall I?
I have another comment.
Oh, then go ahead.
So something else that might be helpful for you is, as you'll notice, Dr. Z pointed out that you can look and see where the pink chalk is compared to the white chalk, right? Something that will be helpful for you is when you are flowing, when you're taking notes, have a separate color of pen, different type of writing utensil. So even if it's a pen and a pencil, I would recommend that you have a blue and a red pen, or a blue and a black pen, 2 different color pens. One color for each team, a color for the affirmatives arguments and a color for the negatives arguments. That way it'll be easier for you to match up who said what, okay? It'll be easier for you to just look really quickly at your notes and see whether or not arguments were dropped and who dropped them. Yes?
What does it say in what echo and then K2?
Oh, this for me, so this tagline, this argument when Dr. Z read it, said that water ecosystems are critical to all ecosystems. So this is another symbol that I use, is K2 for me is water ecosystems is key to all ecosystems. Okay? That's another abbreviation or symbol that I developed. This is kind of a neat thing once you get into flowing, is because you'll find that you'll use your own style of abbreviations as you go on. It's kind of like developing your own system of code. It's kind of funny, I can read my own notes for classes perfectly well. If you show my friends who don't debate, they have no idea what I've written down because it's all in language like this. But I can refer to all of my notes and know exactly what I said. Okay? So this just comes with practice, and as you hear terms said in debate, you'll end up developing an abbreviation for that. Hearing language, for example, that something is critical to something else, like water ecosystems are critical to other ecosystems. The phrase critical to or key to, something you hear a lot in debate. So it's helpful to have abbreviations for that type of language.
Something I do. So let's say that we make some other answers, right? So the affirmative makes some answers here, it makes some answers here, but they don't say anything to this one here. If you're the negative, something I like to do when I'm either side is I'll circle something if it's my argument that my opponent doesn't say anything and drops it, and then I'll draw an arrow across my paper to remind me to tell the judge very quickly, oh, remember this argument, they didn't say anything, they can't, remember they can't make a new argument now, this is mine, I win because, and then I just explain this argument more. So this line is just, I'm a very visual person, so this line for me in the circle just brings my eye to it when I'm standing up in front of people a lot faster. So that's something you can do as well.
Yeah, it made me think of another way you could do that is you could take a highlighter
Yep.
and highlight the argument that's been dropped. All right, good. Any questions about taking notes? There's a particular reason why we talked about note-taking before talking about refutation, okay? And that's because in order to refute, you have to know what your opponent said.